that Aboriginal sense of nationhood or even infrastructure was not highly developed. At no stage did Aboriginal civilisation develop substantial buildings, roadways, a wheeled cart as part of their different priorities.
But you were suggesting in that speech that because they never did develop roadways or even a wheeled cart,
they elected not to, or they chose not to, or they did not to.
That they had no native title entitlements.
They had, I think, less of a claim.
I think it probably is time to move on from that.
And Mr Speaker, I think I can report to the House that today share ownership in Australia is wider than ever before, and Australia has the highest level of direct share ownership in the world.
Hear, hear.
At the moment, we know 1.2 million Australians are regularly running out of food and don't have enough money to purchase more, although we think that figure is fiercely understated because those statistics are so old. And certainly our recipients survey in 2010 and 2011 showed a dramatic increase in the number of people that are accessing services.
Work for the dole has started to change the expectation among some young people that the taxpayer owes them something for nothing.
The capitalist system, which I strongly support, is built on markets, and there is always going to be some measure of speculation, and there are going to be some companies that do well and some companies that fail. That's part and parcel of the capitalist system.
I think what happens is the market actually does play a role here. You know, we're not a centrally planned economy, and we've embraced the open competitive economy that's given us 2 decades of recession-free economic growth.
And so partly it's a natural progression as we get richer and where people go with their demands, and that really shapes the makeup of our economy.
If we talk about the Asian century in Australia, if the government talks about the Asian century, then the Asian countries are our competition, our children's competition. We can no longer compare ourselves with Europe and the United States, which have massive fiscal and structural problems.
Our safety and our quality is higher than other countries, and you cannot tell us...
Labour costs are radically different, as we know. Something like something from $15 an hour compared to $1 an hour. So we can't compete in that section of it. We also can't compete on the expenses side because we have many, many benefits for our workers, and I'm not objecting to the benefits.
We need to compare ourselves with our Asian neighbours, where the entitlements programs of the state are far less.
They paid for the excess hours they work. They don't get overtime. They feel they have to work these extra hours in order to secure their jobs. And a second survey by Canberra think tank, the Australia Institute, shows hours of overwork, that is above 40 hours a week, have skyrocketed since the early 1980s. Last financial year, we worked more than 1 billion hours of overtime. That's the equivalent of 500,000 full-time jobs.
How many Australians do you think are subject to this long-term welfare dependency?
Well, about 500,000 people have been on New Start for longer than 12 months, and they're the people that the government is trying to tackle through programs like mutual obligation and work for the dole.
It sounds cruel and unkind and people lose jobs or whatever, but in fact that is the kind, decent position to hold, because that generates the greatest amount of prosperity. Because to help one is to hurt another. There will always be a manufacturing industry here, maybe a lot smaller, and as it was said, because there's a lot of productivity in manufacturing, numbers decline.
But Andy, the net gain in the last 30 years is from 23% to 8% of our workforce. Yeah. Where's your net gain?
We're nearly at full employment now. We had 44,000 jobs created last
year. But how accurate are those figures then?
Well, 152,000 new jobs since the end of 2007, 140,000 in the last 12 months, 20,000 in the last month.
The best thing you can do for people is give them a work ethic and a work culture. That's the best training you can give them, and that's exactly what Work for the Dollar is doing.
Give them a job, Minister.
But we can't abolish poverty because poverty in part is a function of individual behaviour. We can't stop people drinking, we can't stop people gambling, we can't stop people having substance problems, we can't stop people from making mistakes that cause them to be less well off than they might otherwise be. We cannot remove risk from society without also removing freedom, and that's the last thing that any government should do.
This idea that you can take a long-term unemployed person, a person who left school possibly at 15 because they don't like being in a classroom, give that person a fairly low-level credential course and expect them to suddenly become part of the wired-up economy is just nonsense.
Leaving aside the moral dimension, that every member of the community should be engaged and encouraged and able to participate in the economic opportunities which characterise the modern world, no nation can afford to leave unchecked the waste, economic and social isolation that is the consequence of welfare dependency. Everybody is concerned about the plight of people who are really homeless, but the exact numbers of people who are homeless and the definition of homelessness, as you know, is a fairly fluid matter, and there isn't general agreement anywhere.
4 weeks ago, in a Canberra meeting with Catholic Social Services, Tony Abbott was asked, "The government have committed to halving homelessness by 2020. Should your party be elected, would you continue with that commitment?" Abbott responded that he had difficulties with it, adding, "We just can't stop people from being homeless if that's their choice."
I think the real driver of house price or significant house price falls will be a rise in unemployment. That's the traditional driver of a significant house price decline.
As term deposit rates keep carrying down, self-managed funds are going to take their money out of the deposits and put them into your bank shares.
Sure.
And if they do that, then the banks have got a problem because they've got to go overseas and borrow the money at tough rates.
Well, they're only
real game to be played there.
They're only good investments if property prices don't crash in Australia.
For negative gearing, we didn't agree with the Henry tax review. We ruled that out. We think that an abolition of negative gearing would cause distortions to the property market that we didn't want to see.
Mark Patterson, what do you understand by the concept of the working poor?
I think it's used to describe a situation where people, particularly at the lower end of the labour market, whilst in gainful employment, are unable to meet all of their expectations with respect to living standards.
You say it's expectations, not needs?
Well, it's very difficult to describe and define what needs are. Needs are a collective of people's aspirations.
We will continually look at ways to ensure that people get a fairer deal through lower taxes and less government spending.
Well, income tax cuts help people on welfare. I mean, there's not much point in an income tax cut if you don't have income, is there?
Well, no, you're right in that sense, but I can explain how it will help. If you've got income tax cuts and there's more incentive for people to get work because they get to keep more of the dollars they earn, that in itself is helpful to people on welfare because it just adds that extra incentive.
Isn't it true that there's been a 50% increase in the number of new applications for unemployment benefits in the first 2 months of the year?
Look, unemployment benefit applications normally go up in January as people leave school.
Sure,
it's a normal seasonal development.
But if 50% more are applying this year than in the same period last year, how can you say that's good news?
Well, I'm not saying that it's good news, but again, Laurie, I think we need to keep it in perspective, and the last thing we need to be doing at the moment is talking the economy down. We don't want to give ourselves an attack of the shakes over something which is relatively normal, and the government has two fundamental tasks. First, to try to ensure that the economy is as buoyant as possible, and second, to try to ensure that we have structures in place so that at any given level of economic activity, unemployment is lower than it would otherwise be, and that's where policies such as work for the dole and mutual obligation are so important.
So we've got an employment ministry who seems to be determined to look at this through rose-tinted spectacles, haven't we?
No, I just think we should be realistic. Now, if I was to come in here and focus on gloom and doom, what earthly good would it do? If we don't have economic growth, it's very hard to address some of the community issues that people are so understandably concerned about. If we have economic growth, we can tackle environmental degradation much better than if we don't. If we have economic growth, we can tackle the problem of poverty and unemployment much better. But we can't abolish poverty because poverty in part is a function of individual behaviour. We can't stop people drinking, we can't stop people gambling, we can't stop people having substance problems, we can't stop people from making mistakes that cause them to be less well off than they might otherwise be. We cannot remove risk from society without also removing freedom, and that's the last thing that any government should.
Please explain.
That we won't be introducing policies that put upward pressure on interest rates.
But look, how can we associate freedom and democracy with the free markets? This seems to be a leap of the imagination, because freedom and democracy are not tied to free markets. In fact, we're getting to the situation where corporations rule the world, and privatising all our services is leaving us without a vote. Most of us here aren't shareholders who could influence the direction of corporations. And I still would like to ask the panel, how does a free market or market economics lead us on to morals or ethics?
I think we'll leave that as a hypothetical question, but only because of a time factor, okay? Gentleman here in the front row.
Yeah,
But you cannot ask businesses to give employment where there's no work, or things will just get worse, we'll just get business collapse.
Nobody is going to take away need and sustenance to deserving Australians, Mr. Speaker.
You know, society's obligations are first and foremost and bigger than those of the individual, and we cannot, I don't think, rightly impose more and more demands onto individuals, penalise them brutally when we're not fulfilling our obligations as a society to those unemployed people in the first place.
Is to congratulate ourselves on a big shared achievement, and that is the current strength of our economy. We did it together during difficult days and everybody played their part. And if I can just give you one statistic, because I think it tells the story, since the days of the global financial crisis to now, our economy is 10.3% bigger. In the Eurozone, they've gone backwards. I want, you know, the nation to feel a sense of engagement and connection with our democracy. Ultimately, who they vote for is a question for them, but you want people to be able to look at, you know, the parliament, at political parties and see the big issues being wrestled with.
By any objective criteria, the euro has failed, and in fact there is a looming, impending disaster. You know, this deal makes things worse, not better. 100 billion is put up for the Spanish banking system, and 20% of that money has to come from Italy. And under the deal, the Italians have to lend to the Spanish banks at 3%, but to get that money, they have to borrow on the markets at 7%. It's genius, isn't it?
I don't want to be misunderstood here. We shouldn't be under any illusions. The globalisation of the economy is an irresistible phenomenon that no Australian government should seek to deny. In fact, it would be counterproductive to do so. But before we can embrace reform, we need to clearly understand the environment in which we operate.
If I was to come in here and focus on gloom and doom, what earthly good would it do?
Challenger, go with throttle up. Flight throttle, go ahead. RSO reports vehicle exploded. Copy.
Okay, we're going to take that as a comment.